In the sweltering heat of August 1791, a man stood in a dense, rain-soaked forest in the northern mountains of a Caribbean island and made a decision. His name was Dutty Boukman. For generations, enslaved people on this island who could no longer endure the torment of the sugar plantations had made a predictable choice. They ran. They fled into the high, jagged peaks, surviving in isolated, hidden communities. But on this night, Boukman was not deciding to run. He was deciding to stand, to coordinate, and to burn the most profitable piece of real estate on planet Earth to the ground. That single decision, to shift from individual escape to total, organized annihilation of the colonial system, would ignite a geopolitical shockwave. It would terrify every slaveholding empire in the Atlantic world, redraw the map of the Americas, and prove to a global economy built on human bondage that the enslaved could forge their own liberty with fire and steel. To understand the sheer magnitude of what was about to happen, you have to understand the ground Boukman was standing on. This was not just any colonial outpost. This was Saint-Domingue, the French territory covering the western third of the island of Hispaniola. Today, we know it as Haiti. But in the late 18th century, European diplomats and merchants referred to it as the Pearl of the Antilles. That title sounds poetic, but the reality was an industrial meat grinder. Saint-Domingue was the undisputed economic engine of the 18th century world. The territory was roughly the size of the state of Maryland, yet it produced more wealth than all of Britain's 13 North American colonies combined. Nearly half the sugar and coffee consumed in all of Europe came from this single, mountainous sliver of land, alongside massive quantities of cotton and indigo. The great coastal port cities of France, Bordeaux, Nantes, Marseille, were transformed into opulent metropolises entirely on the staggering profits extracted from Saint-Domingue. When you picture an 18th century plantation, you might imagine a quiet, sprawling farm. Saint-Domingue was closer to a vast, open-air factory. The sugar mills ran day and night, their massive iron rollers crushing cane under the relentless labor of human beings. The smell of boiling molasses hung heavy and suffocating in the tropical air, mixing constantly with the smoke of the furnaces. Generating that kind of astronomical wealth required a labor force, and the French Empire extracted it with a level of calculated brutality that shocked even seasoned observers of the transatlantic slave trade. There were roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue. They were forced to work from before dawn until well after dusk, harvesting razor-sharp sugarcane under a blistering sun. The mortality rate was horrific. The colonial planters literally did the math and calculated that it was more profitable to work an enslaved person to death within 5 to 7 years and simply buy a replacement from a slave ship than it was to provide enough food, clothing, and rest to keep them alive. The colony devoured human beings at a staggering pace. Every single year, tens of thousands of newly captured Africans were chained in the holds of ships and brought across the Atlantic just to replace the dead. Because of this insatiable demand for fresh labor, the demographics of the colony were highly unusual and incredibly volatile. The 500,000 enslaved people were overseen by just 30,000 white colonists. The white population was outnumbered nearly 15 to 1, holding on to power through a regime of theatrical, public terror designed to break the human spirit. Yet the white population itself was bitterly divided. At the top were the wealthy plantation owners and colonial officials, many of whom preferred to live in luxury in Paris, leaving the day-to-day cruelty to hired managers. Beneath them were the poor whites, shopkeepers, artisans, and laborers who fiercely resented the immense wealth of the elite. And caught in the middle were the free people of color. Many were of mixed race, the recognized children of white planters and enslaved women. Some of them had inherited great wealth, owned sprawling plantations, and even owned enslaved people themselves. Yet they were subjected to deeply humiliating racial laws that dictated what clothes they could wear, where they could sit in churches, and barred them from holding public office. It was a society structured entirely around paranoia, held together by nothing but violence and military force. And then, in 1789, a political earthquake struck. 4,500 miles away, the French Revolution erupted. The streets of Paris rang with the new national motto, liberty, equality, fraternity. The Declaration of the Rights of Man proclaimed that all men are born and remain free and equal in rights. When news of the revolution finally sailed across the Atlantic and reached the bustling ports of Saint-Domingue, the colony fractured. Everyone in the free population interpreted the revolution differently, bending its ideals to fit their own ambitions. The wealthy white planters believed liberty meant they were finally free from France's restrictive trade monopolies, allowing them to sell their sugar directly to the British or the Americans. The poor whites believed equality meant they should have the same political power as the rich planters. The free people of color saw a chance to demand full French citizenship, arguing that fraternity must surely abolish the racist laws holding them back. For 2 years, the free population of Saint-Domingue tore itself apart in violent, chaotic political struggles. There were riots in the streets of the colonial capital. Factions armed themselves. The colonial military was fractured and distracted, policing bloody clashes between white colonists and free people of color. The elites were so consumed by their own political squabbles and so utterly blinded by their belief in white supremacy that they failed to notice what was happening right behind them on the plantations. They assumed the enslaved were too broken by the whip, too ignorant, or too culturally divided to understand the political chaos unfolding around them. They were fatally mistaken. The enslaved population was not a monolith of helpless victims. Because of the horrific death rate on the plantations, more than half of the enslaved population had been born in Africa. Many were veterans of brutal, highly organized civil wars in the Congo and West Africa. They were seasoned soldiers. They understood cavalry tactics, guerrilla warfare, and the vital importance of a chain of command. And as they listened to their masters violently arguing about liberty and human rights over dinner, they realized the colonial security apparatus was fundamentally distracted. A clandestine network began to form, passing messages from plantation to plantation. The communication flowed under the cover of night, hidden in the rhythms of the drums, spoken in languages the French overseers couldn't comprehend. The key organizers were the elite among the enslaved, the drivers, the coachmen, the domestic servants, men who could move between estates with relatively little suspicion, which brings us back to that dark, humid forest in August 1791. The location was a place called Bois Cayman. The organizers gathered in the deep shadows of towering mahogany trees, under the heavy threat of a looming tropical storm. They were there to finalize a plan that had been months in the making. They would not beg for liberty from the French Assembly. They would not wait for the white planters to grant them scraps of equality. They were going to take the colony by force. The signal was set. The targets were chosen. As lightning split the night sky over the mountains, a blood pact was sworn to destroy their oppressors or die trying. The most terrifying nightmare of the 18th century Atlantic world was no longer just a fear. It was a schedule. Within days, that schedule was violently executed. On the night of August 22, 1791, the signal went out. The northern plain of Saint-Domingue, the flattest, richest, and most heavily cultivated stretch of agricultural land in the colony, erupted. The sky over the mountains glowed a malignant, pulsing orange as thousands of acres of dry sugarcane were set alight in a coordinated wave of destruction. It was not a chaotic riot. It was a targeted, military dismantling of the plantation economy. The rebels moved from estate to estate, systematically smashing the massive iron rollers of the sugar mills, sabotaging the water wheels, and burning the refineries to their foundations. They were destroying the physical machinery of their torture. For days, the smoke was so thick it blotted out the sun, and ash fell like gray snow on the streets of the coastal capital, Le Cap. White planters who had casually debated the rights of man just weeks earlier now woke to find their overseers dead, their mansions gutted, and their empire of wealth reduced to smoldering cinders. When ships carrying terrified refugees finally reached ports in Philadelphia, Charleston, and Kingston, the news they brought paralyzed the Atlantic world. Slaveholding elites in the American South read the newspaper reports with ice in their veins. George Washington, a slave owner currently serving his first term as president, quickly backed an effort to send arms and cash to the desperate French planters. The geopolitical fear was immediate and contagious. If the most heavily fortified, fiercely profitable slave colony on Earth could be overrun in a matter of days, what would stop the enslaved in Virginia, or Jamaica, or Cuba from doing the exact same thing? Southern lawmakers began tightening local slave codes, terrified that the spark from Saint-Domingue would drift across the ocean. But an uprising, no matter how vast or destructive, cannot survive purely on momentum. As the initial shock wore off, the French military began to regroup. To withstand the inevitable European counterattack, the rebellion needed to evolve into a state, and the scattered fighters needed to become a professional army. That transformation was engineered by a man in his late 40s named Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint was an unlikely architect for a revolution. He had been born into slavery on a sugar plantation, but managed to secure his freedom in his 30s. By the time the revolt broke out, he was a free man who had managed property, owned a small coffee estate, and understood the ruthless mathematics of the global economy. He did not join the fighting on the very first night, but when he did, he brought a level of strategic genius that would completely outmaneuver the greatest empires of Europe. Toussaint looked at the rebel bands, brave men and women fighting mostly with machetes, sharpened agricultural tools, and a handful of captured muskets, and saw that they were vulnerable. They were fighting like guerrillas, which was effective in the mountains. But to hold territory and secure independence, they needed to face European armies on open ground. So, Toussaint pulled back. He recruited a core group of trusted soldiers and ruthlessly drilled them in traditional European infantry tactics. He built a disciplined cavalry. He enforced a strict chain of command. He also understood the geopolitical chessboard perfectly. The French Revolution had triggered a massive war in Europe, and France was now fighting both Spain and Great Britain. Toussaint used this to his absolute advantage. Spain controlled the eastern half of the island, modern-day Dominican Republic. Seeing a chance to bleed their French rivals, the Spanish military offered the Black rebels weapons, ammunition, and official commissions in the Spanish army. Ever the pragmatist, Toussaint accepted. He put on a Spanish officer's uniform and used Spanish gunpowder to batter the French colonial forces. Britain also saw a golden opportunity. The British government wanted to swoop in, steal the immensely wealthy colony from France, and restore the brutal system of slavery to protect their own interests in the nearby Caribbean. Thousands of British redcoats landed on the shores of Saint-Domingue. By 1793, the French Republic was cornered. Their military was collapsing. They were losing territory to the British and the Spanish. and the Black Rebel Army was proving impossible to defeat. A radical French commissioner named Léger-Félicité Saint-Domingue, sent from Paris to try and keep control of the colony, realized there was only one card left to play. If France wanted to keep Saint-Domingue, they had to align with the enslaved. In a desperate, unprecedented move, Saint-Domingue issued a decree abolishing slavery in the northern province. A few months later, the government in Paris went even further, officially abolishing slavery across the entire French Empire. The strategy worked. Once the French Republic decreed that every man was free, Toussaint Louverture executed one of the most famous pivots in military history. He turned on his Spanish allies, declared his loyalty to France, and turned his highly disciplined army against the invading British. The ensuing war was a meat grinder. The British poured tens of thousands of elite troops into Saint-Domingue, expecting a quick victory against former slaves. Instead, they walked into a nightmare. Toussaint's forces waged a brilliant campaign of attrition, drawing the redcoats into the interior, where supply lines broke down. Worse for the British, the island's environment weaponized against them. Yellow fever swept through their camps, turning healthy young men into corpses within 48 hours. The British Empire ultimately lost more than 60,000 soldiers to combat and disease in the Caribbean, a staggering humiliation that forced them to abandon the island entirely. By 1801, Toussaint Louverture was the undisputed master of Saint-Domingue. He drafted a new constitution, declaring himself governor for life. He insisted that slavery was abolished forever and that all men were equal under the law. Yet his rule was steeped in difficult, harsh realities. Toussaint knew that without a functioning economy, the colony could not buy weapons, and without weapons, the European powers would inevitably return to enslave them. So he instituted a deeply controversial system, using military force to compel the newly freed population back onto the sugar and coffee plantations as paid war laborers. It was a grueling, unpopular compromise, but Toussaint believed it was the only way to ensure their collective survival. He sent a copy of his new constitution across the Atlantic to Paris, professing his loyalty to the French Republic. But the political winds in France had shifted violently. The radical revolutionaries were gone. A new, ruthlessly ambitious first consul had seized power in a coup, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon had no interest in black liberty, and he despised Toussaint's presumption of power. Napoleon envisioned a sprawling, globally dominant French empire in the Americas, and that vision required sugar, money, and chains. He quietly assembled the largest naval expedition in the history of France. In the winter of 1801, a massive armada of warships vanished over the horizon, carrying tens of thousands of elite, battle-hardened French soldiers and a secret set of written orders from Bonaparte himself. The objective was absolute: decapitate the black leadership, disarm the population, and force 500,000 free people back into bondage. When General Charles Leclerc's fleet dropped anchor off the coast of Saint-Domingue in early 1802, the illusion of French loyalty evaporated. The war that followed was a descent into pure, unvarnished savagery. Leclerc, Napoleon's own brother-in-law, brought a veteran army that had recently conquered Europe, but they were immediately bogged down in a grueling, relentless guerrilla conflict. Realizing he could not crush the revolution by brute military force alone, Leclerc turned to deceit. Under the false flag of peace negotiations, Toussaint Louverture was ambushed, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic. He would die of pneumonia in a freezing, isolated prison cell in the French Alps, deprived of adequate food and medical care. The French assumed that cutting off the head of the revolution would kill the body. It had the exact opposite effect. When word leaked that Napoleon had successfully reinstated slavery in the nearby colony of Guadeloupe, the black generals of Saint-Domingue, now led by the fierce and uncompromising Jean-Jacques Dessalines, realized this was no longer a war for political autonomy. It was a war of extermination. The final phase of the conflict was marked by unspeakable horrors. The new French commander, General Rochambeau, built drowning pits and imported man-eating dogs from Cuba to terrorize the population into submission. In response, Dessalines ordered a scorched earth campaign, burning down everything that could be of use to the invaders. He ordered his forces to destroy the towns, torch the remaining plantations, and leave the French an earth made of ashes. The climax came in November 1803 at the Battle of Vertières. The Black Army, fighting with staggering tactical precision and suicidal bravery, shattered the remnants of the French expeditionary force. Napoleon had lost 50,000 men in the Caribbean dirt. His grand vision of a global American empire was dead. Cash-strapped and humiliated, Bonaparte immediately pivoted, selling the Louisiana Territory to the United States for a fraction of its value, a direct geopolitical consequence of the Haitian victory that instantly doubled the size of the young American Republic. On January 1, 1804, Dessalines stood before a victorious army and officially tore the white stripe out of the French tricolor flag. He declared the birth of a new, free republic. He rejected the colonial name of Saint-Domingue, reclaiming the original indigenous Taino word for the mountainous island, Haiti. But the empires of the world never forgave Haiti for winning. The United States, terrified of the example a free black republic set for its own enslaved population, refused to recognize Haitian independence for decades. France eventually forced Haiti to pay a crippling financial indemnity for the loss of their human property at the barrel of naval cannons, a crushing debt that suffocated the nation's economic future for over a century. Yet, the legacy of the Haitian Revolution transcends the geopolitical punishment inflicted upon it. In an era when the brightest minds of the Enlightenment wrote elegant essays about human liberty, while simultaneously building vast fortunes on human bondage, the enslaved people of Haiti forced the world to look in the mirror. They did not just demand a seat at the table of humanity, they dismantled the table entirely. They proved that an industrial machine built on total exploitation could be broken, exposing the vulnerability of empires that believed themselves invincible. They were the architects of their own emancipation, and they wrote their Declaration of Independence not on parchment, but on the ashes of the empire that tried to consume them. If you want to understand how hidden chapters of history like this have quietly shaped the borders, laws, and economies of the world we live in today, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Hit the like button if you learned something new, and let us know in the comments, which lesser-known revolution, collapse, or conflict should we cover next?